Very good question. It's important for us to look at the big picture before we start to look at those little details. But I would say, first of all, understand that the ancient Near East is a different world than our own, and be careful about superimposing our own preferences, our own moral uh, awareness, our own intuitions sometimes to a different world in which there were fundamentally different assumptions, different priorities that cultures had. And so we need to accept this culture, not that it's perfect by any means, but accept these things as they are and work with them. In fact, another principle relates to that, that God steps into this culture working with a particular people in an ancient setting with certain priorities and also fallenness. That there is it's a setting where there's warfare, where there is, maybe a bit more of an understanding of kind of the male as the head of things and in the household to a much greater degree, kind of the legal point person and so forth. And so it's just good to understand some of these things so that we don't say, oh, I don't think that that's right. They just have a different structure than we do. They're not operating according to democratic ideals in the ancient Near East like we more often are, and so on. I'd also add that it's helpful to remember that the legislation that we see in the Old Testament is not giving to us the ideal in every case. I mean, love the Lord your God with heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Those are ideals. But when it comes to other laws, certain other laws, Jesus said that Moses permitted certain things because of the hardness of human hearts in Matthew 19:8. So these laws are not the ideal. They're not reflecting the ideal. In fact, many of the laws are pointing back to the ideal of Genesis 1 and 2, at least to some degree. That is really the ideal to look to, that God has made all human beings equal, that there's no classism or anything like that, no master-slave relationship, but God makes human beings, male and female, in his image. That's fundamental equality. And he makes human beings to be, the ideal is man and woman as one flesh for one lifetime in Genesis chapter 2. So we see that God meets people in the nation of Israel, or at least the people as they're forming, meets them where they are and works with them and tries to send them in a redemptive direction through the priorities that he sets out for them. But the law also assumes that people will sin. It assumes that not all the structures in the ancient Near East are ideal, and so God works within those sorts of settings. So that's what I would want to highlight. And a final principle to note would be this: that just because something is described in the scriptures, like in Genesis or the book of Judges or something, it doesn't mean that that description is a prescription for how we ought to behave. Many times the authors are assuming that we will get the fact that this is not to be done, and that we are to learn lessons from this, as Paul highlights in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, where he says that many of the things that the Israelites did were terrible, but these have been recorded so that we might learn from their negative example. So those are a few things that I would highlight as being helpful, and feel free to jump in if you want to, want me to elaborate a little bit more on that. It's helpful to remember that when that, certain offerings or a priesthood or whatever is seen to be eternal, of course, it can just simply mean ongoing. We have maybe a broader view of eternal when we read that word in Hebrew than what it necessarily, or what it may sometimes mean. For example, God says that he is going to create, in Jeremiah 25, he says that the cities that are going to be wiped out by the Babylonians, he said they're going to be subject to everlasting destruction, olam, this word. And, the everlasting only lasts 70 years. that's when the exile will be over, and the people can establish the cities of Judah once again. But more to the point, many of the things that we see taking place in the Old Testament are actually fulfilled in Jesus. So there is actually a subsuming of those laws, of those ideals, of the priesthood of Jesus, and so forth. All of these things are fulfilled in him so that there is the ongoing continuity there. But we also see, as we look back from these, as we look back, we see that there is, as the book of Hebrews reminds us, the fact that the high priest had to go in year after year and offer sacrifices time after time was an indication that it wasn't a satisfactory system, that it actually pointed to something beyond itself. In fact, there was a certain forward-looking nature of the Old Testament that anticipated a day in which a Messiah would come and bring together all of those things, kind of tie everything up and unify those things in his person. And so we have an anticipation in Jeremiah and Ezekiel of a new covenant that is going to come, that there's a new ideal or a better way of operating than the way that the nation of Israel had been operating. That the national gives way to the universal, that the offspring of Abraham that formed national Israel would eventually give way to those who are children of faith in Abraham. And we need to remember, Paul says in Romans 4, that Abraham was declared right by God even before he was circumcised. So that in Genesis 15, he believes God, it's credited to him as righteousness. It's only in chapter 17 that he is circumcised. And it's hundreds of years later that the law comes. So if Abraham is accepted before God, even before circumcision and well before the law, then this is Paul's argument, then we can find right standing with God even apart from the law and be children of faith as Abraham was, who again brings, through the Messiah, brings blessing to all the nations of the earth. So those are a few things that also remind us that we need to see how this eternality or this ongoing or this fulfillment is focused. That yes, there is the language of continual or enduring, but yet it is fulfilled in Jesus, who is the sacrifice, for example, once and for all, but that sacrifice is efficacious ongoingly, that it is not something that just happened once and there is no ongoing power associated with it. Well, in Matthew chapter 11, Jesus is speaking, and he talks about having all authority. And he says that no one knows the Father except the Son, and no one knows the Son except the Father. And so, or reverse that, and those to whom the Son chooses to reveal himself. And so we have a very lofty statement of the authority of Jesus, and then we have Jesus mention that he is gentle and humble in heart. Just 2 verses later. So what's going on here? You can have a great claim to authority, but also you can have someone who is humble. And so when we look at God in the Old Testament, we need to understand that when God is concerned about his glory, I mean, there is something about the ancient Near East in which glory, honor, and so forth, those things mattered. A reputation was important. But it's not as though God is somehow being petty or vain. We need to remember that God has a different status than we do. If God is indeed the foundation and the center of reality, well, for God not to act as though he is the center of reality, as though anything else can go, well, that would be a false representation of himself. In fact, God is jealous for his own name because he recognizes that to run after other names or to find our identity in something else, in some other reputation, is actually self-destructive for us. And that's why God says in the early chapters of Jeremiah 2, he speaks about how his people have left him, have abandoned him this fountain of living waters and have hewn out for themselves cisterns, cracked cisterns that can hold no water. So here, God is saying, I'm the source of sufficiency, I'm the source of fulfillment. But they were running after other sources of fulfillment, which again inevitably disappoint. So God is pointing us to his own reality, reminding us that only in him can we find our ultimate satisfaction. Sort of like what Augustine said, you have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you. So if we try to find our rest somewhere else, if we try to find our glory somewhere else, it's going to be a shattered dream. It's going to be misguided. It's going to be utterly disappointing for us. But if we find ourselves rightly aligned with reality and God at the center of that reality, then we'll find all of these things falling into place. It's sort of like what Jesus says in Matthew 6:33. He says, "Seek first God's kingdom and his righteousness, and all of those things, food, drink, clothing, and so forth, all of those things will be added to you." In other words, get your priorities right, and those other things will fall into place. So it's not as though God is unconcerned about those, but he wants to make sure that we are first seeking first his kingdom, and then all those other secondary things will take care of themselves.